Good afternoon and welcome to this CIEEM webinar. Before we start the main webinar, there's just a couple of notices. The Spring Conference is now open for bookings. It's going to be held in London on the 22nd of March, and it'll be on mainstreaming biodiversity into future cities. The keynote speaker will be Tony Juniper, and there's a range of different delegate rates for CIEEM members that are substantially discounted. We have a number of spring training events coming up that are relevant to bat mitigation and bat work. If you'd like to attend one of these or find out more information, please visit the training and events section of our website, where full details of all the courses are listed. We also have a couple of member network events coming up in Northumberland and also running in Devon. If you want to ask a question in the webinar, all you need to do is go to the top part of your screen and either tap or click on the Q&A button. That will bring you to a small window where you can pose your question. You just click send and that will come through to us. And Fiona and Paul will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar where they'll be picking up your questions and responding to them. So it now gives me great pleasure to pass across to Paul Lintott and Fiona Matthews, who are going to be giving us a presentation on bat mitigation research. Paul and Fiona, I'm going to stop sharing now and you should be able to share your screen.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm hoping that the audio is all right. I've been seeing question and answers flying by saying that the audio keeps cutting out. So if that does still continue to be a problem, if you post that in the chat or the question section, and maybe Lexi can do something about that. What we'd like to do today is basically bring members up to date on our new research project. And starting off, actually, we're just going to give a bit of a background for where all this is coming from. And I'm sure that most people on the line will have had themselves lots of personal experience of trying to do mitigation for bats. So I actually became interested in this question a long time ago when I was working as a consultant, and I was frustrated about the lack of information on what actually worked. And that was back in the late 90s. Sorry, we're just having difficulty progressing our screen. Right. So we've been having lots of conversations with CIEEM about difficulties around getting an evidence base for research, for an evidence base about the effectiveness of mitigation. And we're very glad that CIEEM decided to commission us to do this work with them, and also very grateful to the numerous sponsors who've come forward to help support the project, which basically gives us Paul for a year to work his socks off trying to collate whatever information we can find on mitigation. So what I'm going to do today is give you a quick background to what we know already, give you some preliminary results from work I've been doing at Exeter University in relation to mitigation for greater horseshoe bats. And then we'll also give you some preliminary information from the questionnaire that we sent out just a few days ago, where we've been surveying consultants to just try and get a handle on the scale of engagement with mitigation and what sort of issues there might be. And then we'll tell you more about the research project itself, put out our call for case studies, because we really can only do this work with your help. We've actually, maybe worth saying at this moment, that initially we'd hoped that we would be able to identify all the cases for the study via licensing system, and the longer we go on, the more we think that actually that's quite problematic for all sorts of technical reasons. So we're going to be relying more on members than we'd originally planned. And then there'll be a question and answer session to finish up with. Okay, so what do we know already? Well, I think Patty Briggs was one of the first people to start worrying about the effectiveness of mitigation, and I'm sure a lot of you will know her work, where she went and followed up particularly those occupied by natterers and other myotis, and looked at the effectiveness of mitigation, and found that only 8 of the 36 buildings that were followed up had actually been used, and only 13 of them were judged to actually have potential for the bats to return in the future. Okay, so that was really worrying, and against a context, you did have some control sites which hadn't yet been developed and which were still being used by the bats. So I think that was the first set of alarm bells, that we really didn't know very well how to mitigate for those species. Another project was commissioned by Snowdonia National Park, and in that project 20 sites were assessed in 2010. And of those, 35% of the project seemed to comply with the original planning conditions, which was an interesting bit of slippage, and perhaps one that's quite familiar to lots of people. On a more positive note, about 3/4 of them did have evidence that they were at least used with bats after the mitigation had been conducted. And they came forward with some recommendations, including that there should be actually a compliance check actually written into the mitigation proposals, that full lighting details should be included as part of the application process. And I think we are getting better at that. We do see more and more mitigation plans that do include a proper lighting strategy. But another key element was to ensure that access arrangements for monitoring were very clearly specified, both in the method statement stage and also to try and tie that down through the planning process. So I'm sure that you're all familiar with the situation where you might have planned to do follow-up monitoring, and then the development has been sold and the developer that you were initially working for is no longer part of the project, and getting back on site, and worse, finding somebody to pay you to get back on site, turns into a nightmare. There's also been a National Trust project. So National Trust is obviously a huge owner of estates and of property, a lot of which are occupied by bats. And they realised that they were spending lots of money and lots of time doing mitigation, and wanted to see how effective that was. Now, the projects that were studied covered quite a wide time span, so some of them predated EPSL licensing systems, and the follow-up rate, so the numbers where people had actually been back on site and checked that the follow-up that mitigation was working, the follow-up rate was better with the EPSL cases. And overall, I think this looked fairly promising, in that 85% of them were recorded as being successful, 10% unsuccessful, and 5% partially successful. But the sample size was very low. And another constraint was that in only 38% of the EPSL cases and 5% of the earlier cases, were the monitoring methods actually suitable for looking at the numbers of bats that had returned and to make any sort of assessment of roost functionality. So most of them really just were a sort of one-off visit. Yes, there's some bat droppings there, so that's a tick in the box, and we'll say that bats are using the site, but obviously that doesn't tell you whether it continues to be used as a maternity site, for example. And there were also some cases where there were major works undertaken and where bats did not use the compensatory roost provided, or didn't return after, for example, a major re-roofing work. Although that report has more detail, and you can find it online, looking at the differences between cases where, as they described it, the ecological functionality of the roost was maintained, and compared those with these more major modifications. I think we need to bear in mind that the sample size really was pretty small, and what we're looking for now in our project is really to get more data so we can really see whether there's a difference in terms of success between different scales of mitigation for bats. And then the most recent thing we're aware of that was done was some work by Emma Stone and Gareth Jones looking at the effect of licensing on bat conservation in England. And they looked at 389 licenses and worked out that during 2003 to 5, at least £4 million had been spent on mitigation, and found that 2/3 of licensees didn't actually submit post-development reports. And I have to say that our experience seems to suggest that there's still a big issue with this, that you might think that, you know, that everybody would be submitting reports, but clearly not. And that they were actually only able to find post-monitoring reports for 19% of sites. Oh. Sorry. They looked at differences, or they looked at what happened to different sorts of roosts in terms of whether there was just some disturbance, whether the roost was damaged or whether it was destroyed, and compared that across species. And what they found was that it appeared that for the Rhinolophus, for the horseshoe species, a lower proportion of them were actually destroyed altogether. So it wasn't that a replacement roost was necessarily being proposed or was being licensed, whereas when you're dealing with common pipistrelles, for example, a very high proportion of the EPSL licenses are issued for roost destruction. There's also a slight difference for Dorbenton's bats, where again fewer roosts are actually destroyed for Dorbenton's bats than for other species, and presumably that reflects the fact that a lot of those are in places like bridges, and the proposal wasn't to take the bridge out, it was to do some repair work perhaps on the bridge. So they came up with some recommendations as well. As with some of the other reports, one of the main ones was that we really do need to move to a standardised system to actually allow us to get a handle on what is going on. Because without that, what everybody is doing is they're collecting lots of data, they're ticking the boxes, but there's no actual way of collating it to come up with overall conclusions about whether one system is effective or not. They also recommended that they needed monitoring over longer timeframes and over larger numbers of sites. And a systematic review of bat mitigation is required, which is just what we're doing now. And then the final one, kind of hot off the press in late 2016, was the SNH report on maternity roosts. Now, in Scotland, the number of licenses issued is much lower than in England. So they issued licenses for 67 works affecting maternity sites during the study period. And this study, 28 of those, evidence that the compensation was actually being used. And 18% had a maternity site, a maternity colony that did move in and use the compensatory roosts. 14% of sites had some evidence that the roost was being used, but didn't retain its functionality as a maternity site. And another 7% had non-target species in the compensatory roost. So in other words, something else had moved in. Now, one limitation of this study is that most of the sites had less than one season elapsing before the monitoring actually took place. So in other words, you know, a compensatory roost would be put on site, and then very quickly afterwards there would be some follow-up to see whether or not it was being used. So it's highly likely that actually the take-up of the roost would be higher over the longer term. We do know of some cases where it's taken several years for bats to move in and find an alternative roost. So much as with the Snowdonia National Park report, some of the key recommendations were around including much more detail within the reports. So that's both pre and post construction. And some of the key things are things like the lighting plans, what's going to happen to the habitat surrounding the roost, because you might have the most brilliant des-res bat roost in the world, but if you've removed linking habitat, then maybe the bats can't access it. And also the information should be recorded on the temperature and the humidity of both the original roost and the compensatory roost, and that seems to be done rather rarely at the moment. Also, it would be very helpful if there could be some documentation of how the conditions both inside and outside the roost are likely to change, and that might include consideration of cumulative effects of other things that are happening in the landscape, as well as changes that might occur within the building. So for example, if you're going from an unheated barn to convert it to a dwelling house, you might expect that overall the thermal conditions within the building are going to change. And again, and hopefully now you're getting the message that really what we do need is a long-term monitoring data set, because otherwise we're reliant on these really small sample sizes. Essentially we're into the realms of anecdotes, and it's very difficult to do things like unpick how long it takes for bats to actually find new roosts and to use them. Okay, so that's what's available in the literature so far. I noticed that somebody was asking if those reports would be available afterwards, and I'm sure that Lexi would be able to arrange that. All of them are available online already, but I'm sure they can be put in a central place for you. So I'm just going to outline briefly some of the work I've been doing over the last few months with students at Exeter, and this work was prompted by work I do relating to the management of the South Hams SAC for Greater Horseshoe Bats. And it was really prompted by discussions with colleagues in the local authorities and national parks who were really wondering about how effective mitigation was for bats. And they also face a lot of pressure from developers because, as we all know, lots of developers don't really want to undertake mitigation unless they really have to, and they really wanted to see what the evidence base was for the mitigation being effective. So we looked at sites from 2010 onwards. This is 41 study sites, and went back through the planning records for the local authority, and also pulled up wherever we could the original ECIAs that had been submitted, and tried to compare what had been written in the ECIA, what then had actually been tied down in the planning decision notice. So it might be that as a condition particular things were listed, or it might be that the planning decision notice referred back to the method statement within the ECIA, or it might have been that there were other things in place, like a LEMP or other strategies. So we wanted to see, if you like, where the slippage was between the original plan in the head of the ecologist, what actually made it through to the decision notice, and then what happened on the ground afterwards. These are the sorts of things that people were including as part of their mitigation plans. These being horseshoes, quite a lot of them did include a lighting plan. We had almost 80% here included a lighting plan, and about another 20% had a specific street lighting plan. Now, I should say that the lighting plans were highly variable. Some of them were commissioned, used a proper lighting engineer, and they had modelled lux levels across the sites, whereas others just made a comment like lux levels will be below 0.5 or something like that. Almost 2/3 of them involved habitat creation and habitat management strategies, perhaps about the maintenance of hedgerows. About another 2/3 suggested some form of habitat creation. And another thing I was interested in was the degree to which physical barriers to protect these light-sensitive species from light were incorporated as part of the plan, on the grounds that they might be robust in the longer term compared with things like fences, which we all know, it's very difficult to police house owners and make sure they don't change a hedge into a fence. And on the other hand, if you've specified a fence, somebody could take it down or it could blow over. Anyway, it seemed that physical barriers like bunds actually aren't suggested very often at all. And just to go through some of these case studies, so the positive note, actually, before we start getting depressed by the case studies, is that for a reasonable number, actually, things were implemented as had been hoped, but there was a significant number where there seemed to be real issues. So just to give you some examples, this one said pedestrian lighting should take the form of a downward baffled low-level lighting below 3 lux at ground level. And instead what actually happened was lux levels of 6.7 lux, which were derived from a street lamp, a normal street lamp. Sites designed to avoid the placement of south-facing windows. This was meant to be done in order to protect a flyway, and instead all houses had windows, including south-facing windows. Another one was external security lights on south side of buildings not to be permitted. In fact, all the houses had security lights because this development was a dark one where no street lights were allowed. And the difficulty with that is then people, Mrs. Jones doesn't like tripping over a doorstep or a cat when she comes out into a dark environment, and so they go to B&Q and get a massive PIR light. Another one example, 5 bat boxes will be installed. This clearly wasn't with horseshoes in mind, or one would hope not, but no evidence of bat boxes was actually found on the site. Okay, and just a final thing that we've pulled out so far was to look at where the time lag between the issuing of the decision notice and the development actually happening in any meaningful sense. Now, of course, we all know that people can get around constraints of when to start development by just digging a footing or something, but it looked like there were actually rather a lot of them where there was substantial time lags, 3 to 4 years or more before they, sorry, I'm going the wrong way. How do I go backwards? Previous? Sorry about that. Yeah, there was a substantial lag between the decision notice and the development actually happening. And I noticed with the new white paper that was announced last week, one of the recommendations there is that actually house building needs to start very quickly after permission is given. Now that obviously has, there's good things about that, which means that the most recent ecological report is more likely to be relevant. On the other hand, if we want to do decent pre-construction monitoring, sometimes there can be an argument that an extra year can actually give you helpful data. Okay, and then the final thing to come out of this work so far was we looked at the differences between the mitigation measures that have been proposed by the consultant and what had actually made it through to the decision notice. So in other words, we're trying to look at where things are getting added or stripped out. So one thing was that actually there was quite a lot of adding detailed lighting plans to the decision notice. So in other words, the ECIA hadn't really gone into lighting plans, but clearly somebody in the local authority had been on the case and had gone and insisted that that happened. Habitat creation, though, and habitat management that had initially been suggested, often that wasn't being pinned down at all. So there wasn't even a reference in the planning consent, so you must follow the methods that have been put in the ECIA. A couple of cases where permanent barriers were introduced at the planning decision stage and a street lighting plan. Okay, what I'm going to do at this moment now is hand over to Paul, who's really, what's that? Oh, I'm doing this. Oh, I'm being told what to do. Okay, right. Yeah, so just to give you a brief introduction then, what we want to do now is to gather some evidence on the scale of mitigation for bats, and hopefully you will have already received a questionnaire on the 1st of February, and we can send a reminder link. The questionnaire still is live if you haven't got it, and the link will be sent to you this afternoon with the feedback form. Okay, but we've been really pleased with the level of engagement we've had already. We've had 210 responses. That means we can tell you something about that now. So, for those of you who haven't yet looked at the report, just to run through some of the things sorry, for those of you who haven't yet completed the questionnaire, this is just to give you a flavour of some of the information that we gathered so far. So I'm going to pass over now to Paul.
So this is like the cases where mitigation just adds for observation here. We're finding that about 20% of cases involving bats in buildings, about 70% of the time mitigation was conducted. Of those, about 65% required an EPS license.
Paul, I'm so sorry, it's Lexi here. We can't hear your audio at all. I don't know if you can move so you're a little bit closer to the mic. Fiona was really clear, but we can't hear you at all.
Can you hear me better now? Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thanks very much.
I've just wheeled Fiona out of the way, so I can take over now. So yeah, so just to recap what I was saying about there, these are results based on our questionnaire, and we're looking at the number of cases where either mitigation has been conducted. So we're finding that in about 70% of occasions where mitigation was conducted within buildings, an EPS license was required. We found that in these projects, only about 10% of cases assessed the wider impact, the cumulative impact. Conversely, we were finding that over 80% of cases were recommending bat boxes as a mitigation strategy. In terms of recommendation, we're finding that consultants were recommending about monitoring to be conducted about 50% of the time, and we're finding that monitoring occurred about 45% of the time. So there was a difference between monitoring being recommended and monitoring actually occurring. We were also interested in finding out if people had encountered a situation where they either recommended monitoring or they recommended compensation. And we had permission from the client. The client was quite happy to pay, but an SNCO or local authority deemed it unnecessary. So we found that quite promising, that over 60% of consultants hadn't come across the situation, but over 20% in both monitoring and compensation had found that SNCOs had stopped monitoring from occurring. A lot less for local authorities, and just a few for both SNCOs and local authorities recommending that monitoring wasn't required. We therefore asked, do you think occasions where SNCOs or local authorities have deemed monitoring unnecessary have become more regular during the past 5 years? And there was about a three-way split between yes, no's, and unsures. So we kind of wanted to dig down a little bit deeper. So we got some kind of revealing questions in terms of asking, why do you think this is? So we had some saying there's a lack of resources in local planning authorities and SNCOs, so there's less ability to monitor compliance. You had some quite positive responses saying, actually, when I've recommended monitoring, it has always been approved and I feel like I've been supported. Conversely, the third quote, there seems to be no uniform process or guidelines at Natural England. It seems very dependent on whose desk an application lands on in terms of if monitoring is required. So again, there's not the standardization across Natural England itself. And then finally, a topic which a lot of people picked up on was that Natural England presumably wants to be seen to be minimising the costs for mitigation for developers and themselves. There's lots of negativity around bats. And again, do we want to be piling on more cost in terms of asking people to monitor every particular site? And finally, again, this lack of understanding and buy-in from planners lack of willing from developers, which I think is one of the key things. Maybe it's not been hammered home to developers that monitoring could be a really useful strategy to actually improve effectiveness down the line, and therefore people won't do anything more than just undertaking their basic legal requirements. So moving on to the aims of the project, which we're developing, and as Fiona mentioned, CIEEM, in partnership with the University of Exeter, have secured funding to help fill this evidence gap, looking at the effectiveness of mitigation and compensation strategies to help bats. Now, this schematic outlines the details of the case studies we require, alongside highlighting how our project will sit alongside BCT's Fairburn funded project, which is also looking at mitigation. The data collection part of the project is being conducted in collaboration with BCT, as we really want to minimise the time and effort that consultants have to go to share the data. Receiving the data from consultants is absolutely key to this, and we don't want to split your time between the CIEEM project and the BCT project. So again, data sharing will occur between both of us. However, as we move down this flowchart, I'll really highlight what distinguishes the two projects. And the main part of that is how the analysis will be conducted. So in terms of moving down the flowchart, what we're after case studies where there's been damage or destruction to a bat roosting site or resting place. And specifically at the minute, we're interested in looking within buildings. Down the line, potentially hope to expand the analysis to look at more landscape level things, but for this project in itself, we're going to be focusing on roosts within buildings. Secondly, we're only interested in cases where mitigation was completed between 2006 and 2014. This allows us to consider cases which should have been based around the bat mitigation guidelines, which were published in 2004 up until now. Although we would like mitigation to have been completed by 2014, it's fine if monitoring is still ongoing, as long as you conducted at least one monitoring session between 2014 and now. Thirdly, we've restricted which species we wish to look at to those most commonly encountered across the UK and Ireland, and also those which commonly roost in buildings. So therefore, we're interested in case studies for myotis, common pipistrelle, soprano pipistrelle, and brown long-eared bats. Once these relevant case studies are selected from your end, the next thing that you need to do is upload your reports or information so that we can access them. I'll talk you through how to do this procedure shortly. However, just to highlight that we have multiple methods of how you can share the data, and this is designed to make it as efficient and time-saving for you as possible. So either you can upload your reports via a secure Dropbox folder and just supply us some very basic information about the site, such as the license number if it was licensed, and also the site name. And then we'll do the work and extract all the information we require from the reports. Alternatively, if the information isn't contained within your reports, for example, if it was unlicensed, or you've yet to compile your monitoring records into a formal report, then either you can upload the relevant reports and supplement this with questionnaire answers, or just complete our questionnaire and give us the information yourself. So beyond that, the CIEEM and University of Exeter project is specifically interested in cases where post-mitigation monitoring has been conducted. We'll use this information to undertake a meta-analysis using this data that you've supplied to assess the effectiveness of various mitigation strategies. The BCT project is interested in cases where either just mitigation has been conducted or cases with both mitigation and monitoring. However, what's critical for BCT is a willingness of the consultant to contact the owner of the site to allow access to monitoring. They'll then undertake field work to investigate the longer-term implementation and effectiveness of mitigation strategies. So essentially, we'll be using a meta-analysis of the data you've already collected, or BCT are prepared to go out and do some field work themselves. So we realise that when you're sharing data, there's always privacy issues and there's always this concern. We can clarify that both projects, any data which is uploaded will be fully anonymised and saved securely. We won't include any revealing characteristics about a site unless this is specifically agreed in advance and in writing with both the site owner and relevant ecological consultant. And it is worth stressing that this will be for a minority of cases, and particularly for the CIEEM project and the University of Exeter project, looking at meta-analyses, we'll be focusing more on generalised reports, which go across all the case studies rather than asking for individual case studies to be included in the evidence guidance. So this is one of these critical slides, which is really easy to miss, but we're really keen to ensure that we don't cherry pick examples. We're really keen to ensure that the case studies we're provided with are a random sample of cases. The study becomes a lot less effective if we're only presented with cases where you know that mitigation has worked, or vice versa. We'll have a really biased view of if a mitigation action is successful or not. We're therefore keen that, again, you supply this random sample. In an ideal world, you buy into this project, see the benefits of establishing this robust evidence base for mitigation, and you provide us with all the relevant case studies that fit our criteria. That's brilliant, and then we can always do the random sampling within your case studies. However, if you're unable to provide us with all these relevant case studies, then a random subsample would also be great. There's multiple ways of ensuring that you do this, and we're obviously happy to discuss that if you want to come to us and say, could you give us some advice? I'll just talk you quickly through one approach, which involves making sure you can randomize to Excel. So hypothetically, let's say you had a spreadsheet with all your site names, which species were present, and you wanted to randomly pick a couple of examples to send us the case studies. So first of all, you need to create a new column alongside each of your site names. You can call this random number, and you're entering the function equals rand and then those brackets. And when you press enter, this will give you a random number. What you need to do is drag this down alongside all the rows until you have an equal number of rows as other columns. So each site is designated a random number. And then the final step is to select all columns and use the sort and filter and then custom sort function to allow you to randomly sort your sites. So when you do this, it will give the site names in a random order, and again, you could just select the top 5, top 10, whatever was easiest for you. So obviously there are other ways, but we'd be really keen to ensure that we're confident that the case studies provided to us are a random sample, because we don't want to have any bias. So the next slides will illustrate the level of detail that we either require to extract from your report, alongside highlighting what information will be expected if you decide to fill in the questionnaire rather than uploading your report. So again, I'm just going to talk about what data we'll be capturing about the process. So firstly, we're going to be looking at a few basic questions about the building that contained the roost. This is the first thing you do when you go to a new site, isn't it? You look at what the building is. So these are examples such as what type of building contained the roost. Was it residential, agriculture? Was the roost within a shed? And similarly, questions such as what was the lining of the roof comprised of, or was there insulation material on the floor? Secondly, we want to capture your pre-development ecological surveys. For example, if you conducted daytime roost inspection surveys, then you can state which species were found and how their presence was assessed. For example, were bats observed directly, or did you infer their presence from droppings or feeding remains? And this again starts building up the evidence base for us to allow us to compare your pre-construction with your post-construction monitoring. Thirdly, we would like a summary of your findings from having conducted all of your surveys. After putting all the evidence together, what was your final assessment of the roost? For example, what was the estimated size of the bat roost? How many, say, common pipistrelles did you think were within the roost? And were you able to predict the function of the roost from your surveys? Alongside this, we would like to know details about where the bats were roosting, were they behind cladding or, say, hanging tiles? Were they in joints between main roof timbers? And also, if they were roosting against material, what that material was. So again, just building up this information base about what the roost was like before the mitigation occurred. And on top of that, we'd like to know about the bat roost entrances, and also capture a few details about the surrounding landscape. For example, proximity of nearest vegetation, or the presence of artificial lighting. So after that, we're interested in what mitigation was proposed. And we broadly split this into a few main categories, and these are the provision of roosting space internally. So these are case studies where mitigation has been conducted to preserve the presence of a roosting space within an existing building. Secondly, we have a provision of roosting space within an alternative structure. So these are cases where mitigation has been conducted to provide a bat roost somewhere else. So this could be, for example, an integrated bat box into a different building or bespoke bat houses. And finally, we're interested in looking at mitigation strategies which were used to minimise the illumination of bat roosts or flight lines between the roost and commuting routes. We also want to know, was this implemented? So again, we'll be capturing mitigation actions, but also if these were implemented correctly. For example, if we're looking at the provision of roosting space internally, we'll be asking questions such as if the space available for bats to roost changed under proposed mitigation, and if it did this increase or decrease, and do you have the size of the new roost space? Was this implemented correctly, and so on. And finally, beyond that, we'd like to collect your monitoring records. So the basic details about your post-development ecological surveys, and this section replicates the pre-development ecological surveys. We're able to do a really nice before and after survey. So now I'm quickly going to switch off PowerPoint and jump to Chrome. So there might be a slight delay here, but I'll show you how easy it is to upload the data so you can see for yourself what you can be doing this nice Friday afternoon. So hopefully you should be able to see Google Chrome now, and the web link will be sent around by Lexi this afternoon. So when you log on to the Survey Gizmo page, you'll see this introduction. And again, this is just highlighting what I've been through, kind of stressing what information we require and how you can provide it. So just scrolling to the bottom here. At the minute, we have a little outline about data privacy, and then you can start uploading your data. So at the minute, the only option that you have is to upload a case study where all the details are contained within the report. We will extract this information, and if there's any queries we may contact you, but generally you just need to upload. The other two options where you can upload reports and then supplement this with a questionnaire, or just fill in the questionnaire, will become live in a week or two, and again, CIEEM will be sending out an email about that, and we'll also be publicising the launch of the project fully. But we're really keen to start collecting reports now, so if you do have any case studies you can think of, or you can find where you can upload all of the details, please do that. So let's select that one, and again, it talks you through step by step. And the next section is to click this link. So this is where we want to upload our case studies. So if we click the link, it'll open up a new tab, and here it's a secure Dropbox, which is only accessible to CIEEM and BCT, and you can log into your computer and choose which files you wish to upload. And it's as simple as that. That will give you a few specific details to enter, so we can track your files, but essentially that's it in terms of uploading your files. And back to the Survey Gizmo, we then just need really basic information. So we need your license number, if it was licensed, site name, site address, and any additional details that you think we should be made aware of. And there's the option to upload multiple case studies, so don't feel like you only have to upload one. So if you have uploaded an additional one, click yes. And again, the information is there to give us that basic information. But that's all the information we're after at this stage. We're just really keen to get the reports, and we've got a team who can work on it and extract the data that we require. So after that, click next. And this is a question from BCT asking if you'd be willing to contact the owner of the site on BCT's behalf. Totally up to you if you select yes or no. If you select yes, it will give you a letter which you can use to contact the landowner with. So you can copy and paste that into an email or print out into a letter. I'll select no for now, and then we just ask your contact details. So again, this is very basic things such as name, company name, email address, and telephone number. And that's it. You then submitted your questionnaire and your case study. So really should be quite simple, and hopefully we really rely on you. So the more case studies you can share with us, the better. Just going to jump back to PowerPoint for the last slide. So hopefully you can see PowerPoint. And just to say, to emphasize the fact that we really do need data. Web page is live and accepting reports, as I just showed you. And the web link will be distributed via CIEEM this afternoon. Any questions you have, please feel free to drop us an email. The email address is backmitigationresearch@cieem.net, and we'll respond as soon as possible. So thank you for listening, and if you want to ask us any questions and answers, we'll do 5-10 minutes now. So we've had a few questions, including one by Chris Savage, which is there a standardised time frame within which we can confirm a compensatory roost has been taken up by bats?
I think at the moment there isn't actually a standardised time frame. One of the things that we could perhaps do very usefully in this project is if we've got enough case studies where we've got a number of years of monitoring, it would be very interesting to know, you know, after 3, 4, 5 years, are we still getting signs of bats returning to a site or taking up a site for the first time? I'm just looking through the other questions here. Okay, so somebody's asking, Lucy Gibson said, I know that you've stated that monitoring of bat mitigation needs to be undertaken over a longer period than at present. Will the need for longer term monitoring of bat mitigation be taken forward into legal requirements, i.e. as part of the licence? At the moment, I'm not aware of any plan to do that, but it may well depend on the outcomes of this project. I know that it was highlighted to Scottish Government that monitoring seemed to not be done for a sufficiently long time to enable the success to be evaluated. So it may well be that the results of this project feed into that process. Chris Savage also asked about things becoming non-compliant if they didn't do what was meant to have happened in the mitigation licence or the or specified as part of the planning condition. And the short answer to that is yes, it does. It does make them non-compliant, and I've followed this up with a couple of local authorities in the southwest. The issue is that the implementation of mitigation passes over to be the responsibility of the development control officer. So whilst a local ecologist might have been employed by the local authority, and of course lots of local authorities don't even have a advisory ecologist, but assuming that they do, the problem is that once planning consent is given, the process of ensuring that the mitigation is conducted as planned, that actually falls on the development control officer, who's more used to checking things like whether the correct shade of brick has been used or whether a wall is the height that was originally proposed. So I'm afraid that lots of the ecological requirements seem to fall down that gap, and at the moment there doesn't seem, well, I think there may well be variability between local authorities in how tied in the system is for monitoring what happens once planning permission is given. Certainly with the local authorities I dealt with, there was no scheme through their IT system for the ecologists to be reminded, for example, to check whether a monitoring report had been received, or indeed to be prompted to do anything if there was no compliance. So I think that this is just a big failing in the system at the moment. It'd be interesting to know how frequently that will, how frequently that comes up in the information you supply.
So we've got a question from Robert asking, do case studies from the website need to be uploaded, or will you get those from the website?
Okay, the answer to that is I don't think we can.
Paul, sorry, could you just repeat the question?
Yeah,
Paul, sorry, can you repeat the question?
We're both bad about that. The case studies from the REIS website need to be uploaded, or will you get those from the website?
What we would need is some indication that your case study is already on the Roost website, and therefore but you'd be happy for us to get back in touch with you about it, because it may well be that we need additional information that isn't just on the website, and we're fine to do that. We can phone you up or whatever, but we just need to know who you are.
Paul, I'm really sorry, we can't hear you at all.
Yeah, just to clarify, just to kind of back up what Fiona said, I think, in terms of asking for information from the Roost website, we will have a look at what's on there. But if you can contact us and say, I've uploaded my case study to the Roost website, we will we'll get in touch with you and supplement any questions that you may have, or any questions that we may have about your case study.
Somebody else has asked, would we be able to confirm the time period in which case studies should have taken place? We're basically happy to take whatever is available. So all we need is that there should have been at least one session of follow-up monitoring.
So, in the CIEEM University project, which is in England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland, so it will be a full-on a UK and Republic of Ireland approach.
We've also been asked whether we'd be able to look at how the different SNCOs or LPAs vary, and we could certainly do a comparison perhaps between the different countries of the UK and also the Republic of Ireland, to look at how the systems vary and what that actually means for bat mitigation. Yeah, we've got a question here. Why do we think that habitat creation and mitigation proposals are falling down and not being implemented? Can understand the management as developers don't really want the management lag, but rather to move on to the next project. And I think that's probably a good point. I think there's often you know, you can agree a site plan perhaps at the outset, which a developer is willing to agree to in order to get the planning permission. And then I think we get into issues of perhaps one developer then sells the site on to another developer who is less aware of perhaps the need to put in provision for bats. And also I think there is some slippage on the part of, it may even not be that the SNCB or the local authority has taken an active view that the mitigation is unnecessary. It's just that it's not actually tied down in the wording of the consent, and therefore it just gets forgotten about. Everybody thinks they don't have to do it.
So we've just had a question asking if we can confirm that it's only really projects where post-development monitoring has been completed that you need, and for the CIEEM project, that's correct. It doesn't necessarily have to have been license monitoring. It could be that you're really interested in the case and you've gone back and you've done some voluntary monitoring yourself. We'd still be keen to collect that, as long as obviously the survey and procedure was standardised, but we're keen to kind of capture that as well.
BCT, on the other hand, they are interested in cases even if there has yet been no follow-up monitoring.
Fiona and Paul, I see this question from Lindsay Robinson, who's asked if you're interested in the sizes of development, if it's just single residential dwellings, or if it's also up to large housing schemes.
Yes, we're interested in everything. Yes, please. Ali Slade would like to know when the project's results will be known. Basically, you'll get them as soon as we know them. And this project began in December, and at the moment we have funding for a year. And at the moment we're very much focusing on developments affecting roosts in particular, or buildings, but there might be potentially in the future also, you know, if sponsorship is available, to look at wider landscape scale issues. So, you know, it might be that your consultancy is particularly involved in road schemes, for example. Those sorts of things are not included within this project at the moment.
Fiona and Paul, I think we've probably got time for perhaps one more question. I don't know if there's any others that have come in that you might like to answer, but perhaps if there's just one more. I know there are a few questions that we haven't been able to cover, but I think you have covered most of them.
And just to clarify again that we will, if you have any individual questions, please feel free to email us and we'll respond as soon as possible. And we're really keen to kind of get you on board because the more reports you can get, the better.
Just to finish off, somebody asked whether we're looking into why SNCOs don't follow up their licence report form. I think that's probably a bit outside our remit at the moment, but what we would hope is actually even the information that we've gathered so far by actually putting questions to the statutory authorities about how many licence returns have they got. We're hoping that that will at least act as a prompt for the system to be improved in future, and I'm sure that that's something that CIEEM also will be keen to pursue with them.
Yes, thank you very much, Fiona. Thank you both, Fiona and Paul, for a really interesting presentation and outline of your project. As Fiona and Paul have already mentioned, we will be sending out some links this afternoon to the web link and also to the Dropbox where you can upload your case studies. We'll also be able to make some of the research reports that have been mentioned in the webinar available. The slides themselves won't be available, but we have made a recording of this webinar, which we'll be putting up onto our website within the next week, and we'll send out a link when that's there, so you can go back to review the slides if you want to refer back to them any. We'll also be asking you for your feedback on the webinar, and you'll get a link to that in an email this afternoon. Thanks very much for persevering with the audio problems we had at the start of the webinar, and I hope that they were resolved and that you're able to enjoy getting some useful information from the presentation that we've had today. Just to finish off, if you are planning to log this webinar in your CPD record, sorry, I just need to have a few problems here. It'll count as structured CPD, and the relevant competencies are M5 and SM3. If you want to put that straight into your CPD record using the CPD tool, you can do so. Just log in, put in all the details, and you can pull down the relevant competencies. I think all that remains is once again thank Fiona and Paul for joining us this afternoon, and thank you for tuning into this webinar. We look forward to seeing you at future events. Thank you very much.